Now, being completely honest, I wish I didn't have to teach this lesson. And the reason for that is what I'm about to teach you is an adaptation to the scoring that I didn't tell you about. I essentially told you fibs a little bit on the scoring week. In that, there is an adaptation. Each board by board, the scoring slightly is modified. And the reason I wish I didn't have to teach you is because it is completely unnecessary. This game is difficult enough. I'm sure you'd all agree with that. But it's in the game, and I can't avoid it, and it's a nuance and a kind of an intricacy to the game that I have to tell you about because it does impact the scoring, and impacting the scoring means it impacts the way you play. Simple as that. So what you may or may not have noticed is that when I give you these hands that I have set up, some of them have coloured patterns on them, red and green, or red and green the other way, or everybody is red, or everybody is green. Now you might have noticed that, or you might not, but the reason is not just someone likes colouring in red and occasionally they colour in green, it's because there is an extra layer to the scoring. Now what that's called is vulnerability. Now you could argue you always feel vulnerable at the bridge table. Perhaps now, yes, but I promise you that you will feel better soon. What these colour schemes mean is red means you are vulnerable, green means you are not vulnerable. Now, again, I wish it didn't really exist, but it does. What that means is, when you are vulnerable, you lose more points should you fail your contract, but you get extra bonuses if you make bonus contracts. So there's a high risk, high reward thing in play there. Not vulnerable, you lose the same points I've told you, and your bonuses stay the same. So essentially, being vulnerable means you shouldn't push as much as you would normally, and being not vulnerable means you can err on the side of aggression. This impacts your bidding because what I was just talking about, going off versus not going off, you actually lose more points by being vulnerable. So being an overcaller especially, it's important to know if you're not vulnerable or vulnerable, because being vulnerable is a downside if you think your contract is going to fail, which means bidding aggressively is not always as good when you are a vulnerable pair versus being not vulnerable. So what are the score implications? So firstly, failing in your contract, if you are not vulnerable, i.e. green, so anyone on this particular hand, you lose 50 points per trick. So that's exactly what I've told you. When I told you about the scoring, I was talking about not vulnerable scoring. I didn't tell you I was talking about that, I told you this is the scoring because I didn't want to overflow you with information. But the information I've given you so far is all about us being green. So if we only ever played on board 8 or board 1 or board whatever it is, you would not need to know anything. However, if you are red or vulnerable, you lose twice as many points. You lose points twice as quickly. So that means if you fail your contract by 1, instead of losing 50, you lose 100. If you go 2 off, instead of it being 100, it's 200. It is linear and it is twice as fast. So it very quickly becomes expensive when you are red. It's much easier or much more recommended to go off when you are not vulnerable. It makes a big impact losing twice as many points. Now, this is making the assumption that you have failed in your contract. That is a negative thing, I'm assuming there. I'm assuming you've either bid aggressively, bid too much, bid optimistically, or maybe you've bid as an overcaller and you've pinched it off them. But essentially, it's an adaptation to your bidding because you are aware, oh, we're vulnerable. Do I really want to push? Because if I go 1 off, instead of losing 50, I've lost 100. And if I go 3 off, instead of losing 150, I've lost 300. Now, if you do bid a contract that is making, hopefully some of us do that some of the time, you actually gain points for being vulnerable. Essentially, you are rewarded for being brave, if you will. So being vulnerable is a high risk, high reward. The people who like to gamble will like being vulnerable because it means you get rewarded for being optimistic, let's say. But of course, that could come crashing down should you fail in your contract. So it's a complex thing that is a hand by hand. You have to think about it each time rather than just a bid more aggressively or don't bid more aggressively. Now, the way you get more points by being vulnerable is your bonuses change. The only thing that changes is your bonuses. So if you make 3 spades, you still get 3 lots of 30. That doesn't change, your baseline doesn't change. It's only the bonuses that change. Part score bonuses do not change at all. So I'm going to write this down in a minute over here, but essentially part score bonuses stay at 50. What this means is, if you are vulnerable, it is only a downside if you're playing in a part score. If you play in 2 spades, It's only bad that you're vulnerable, because either you make your contract, in which case you get nothing extra, or you go off in your contract and you lose twice as many points. Being vulnerable is definitely a negative if you are battling for a part score. However, bidding game, your bonus goes up. Essentially, the vulnerability rewards you for being brave. So bidding a vulnerable game, instead of your bonus being 300, your bonus goes up to 500. It's considerable. So what that means is, if we were to make 4 hearts, that's 4 lots of 30, which is 120. Normally we would get 300 as a bonus for that, which is 420, which is what we've been doing. If you're vulnerable, instead you get 500 as a bonus. So you get 620. That's the main area where vulnerability and not vulnerability makes an impact. Game and part score. Part score, it's only a negative to be vulnerable. Game, it can be a positive as long as you make your game, because your bonus goes up. Now, the bonus also goes up, it skyrockets in slam territory. If you bid a small slam or a grand slam, you get a colossal amount extra. Your bonus goes from 800 for a small slam to 1300 for a small slam, being vulnerable or not. Your bonus, this is silly, your bonus goes from 1300 for a grand slam, not vulnerable, to 2000. It's massive. So if you bid a vulnerable grand slam, you score 2,200 and something points, depending on what suit you're in.
If you get it.
If you make it, of course. It's massive. It's like 10 hands more worth of points in that one thing. Now, the vulnerability there is a big advantage if you make your contract, because instead of making 1510 for your 7 hearts, you make 2,210. You get an extra 700 points. So as you get higher and higher up the rung, you are more and more rewarded for being vulnerable, because essentially you're being braver and braver and braver still. That doesn't mean you should just bid like a lunatic as vulnerable, because of course it's a two-sided thing. If you fail in your contract, you lose more points. So you have to be careful. If you think vulnerability is going to harm you because you feel like you're going to fail, you want to be cautious. If you think you're going to walk your contract, you can be more adventurous. Depends on what you think's going on in the hand. Being not vulnerable, your bidding shouldn't really add up to too much, because we're used to that. That's how we've been scoring so far. What I will say is, if you are thinking about making an aggressive decision, consult the vulnerability. Not vulnerable, it's probably worth pushing that extra 1. I'm sure you'll have all seen it last week where you go, I've pushed them 1, should I push them 1 more? That's basically what the kind of nature of overcalling. Vulnerability comes into that big time. Now, I'm going to put those bonuses over there in a minute, the way they change, so you don't have to memorise them. But I just want to do a few hands of how vulnerability might impact a decision. Now, firstly, what I want to say, I want to stress this point, it does not impact your basic bidding. It doesn't change the decision whether you should open the bidding or whether you should respond or not. The points remain the same. The only time vulnerability impacts your decisions is when you get to those fine margin decisions. There will be a point when you arrive in the bidding where you think, should I go 1 more or not? And that's where to think about the vulnerability. It isn't, I've got 13 points, I'm vulnerable, I don't want to open the bidding. You should still open the bidding with an opening hand. That doesn't change. It only changes when you're making those fine margin decisions. They bid 3 clubs, should I push to 3 hearts? Or we've bid 3 hearts, should I push for our 4 heart game? Okay? It's only those moments where you're kind of on the edge. Should I go for it or should I not? That's where vulnerability impacts your decision, or should impact your decision. Vulnerability is not kind of consulted enough by the inexperienced player. It's something that you will, the more and more experience you get, the more and more important you realise it is for those fine decisions. Because going off vulnerable is basically very expensive. So you want to try to not be too hyper-aggressive when vulnerable. Now, last week I didn't tell you about this, so I saw some out there, hyper-aggression, and part of me was going, you're vulnerable, but you weren't vulnerable because I didn't tell you anything about vulnerability. So last week, if you like, you had a bit of a free license to be hyper-aggressive, which I like, because I wanted to encourage you into that theme, because I like that kind of thing. But just be aware now, there is prices to be paid should you be vulnerable, okay? So it's not just a case of the most cavalier player out there will win, okay? So you've got to be careful somewhat when you're vulnerable.
2 questions.
Yes.
What determines vulnerability?
Good question.
Yeah.
And second question.
Yes.
What's the relationship between vulnerability and doubling?
Both good questions. First question, the vulnerability is completely random in theory, although there is a 16 pattern. So boards 1 through 16, it's not vulnerable, north, south, east, west, everyone, north, south, east, west. You don't need to memorise a pattern because it says it on the board. But essentially there is a pattern that every 16 boards it repeats itself. So board 17 is the same as board 1. It was decided by someone. I don't know. There is a little rhyme how you can remember the pattern. Don't worry about it. Essentially, just look at this. I don't know the patterns off by heart. And although I've just named the first few, I don't know them all. But it is a pattern, but it's random in nature, if you see what I mean. It's not a linear pattern every 4 kind of thing. And the second question, doubling is something I will get on to week 14. But essentially, it's more expensive if you double them vulnerable. So again, it's a negative aspect. But I'll get more into it not next time, but the time after that. Okay.
If you've got a vulnerable deck, is everyone vulnerable around the table?
Not necessarily. It might be. Like board 3, north-south are not vulnerable, but east-west are vulnerable. So what that means is, if north-south and east-west have a competitive auction of 1 heart, 2 spades, 3 hearts, 3 spades, north-south might then be more willing to go off. Having said that, east-west might have been more chicken based on the fact they're vulnerable. So you can get it where one of you has basically an advantage in the competitive scenario because you are more at free will to go off, if you see what I mean. Of course, bidding contracts that fail when you could have bid one that makes is a bad decision, whatever the vulnerability. I'm talking about where you're thinking, should I push one more, should I not? East-west will be more likely to hold back with that fine margin decision, whereas north-south will be more likely to go that one extra. So all about that fine moment, okay? Yes?
Are the computer dealt cards dealt with that in mind?
No, pure random. Well, my cards are dealt with that in mind, but the computer dealt ones, the pure random are pure random. Just so happens you'll be vulnerable sometimes and sometimes not. Okay? Right, now let's have a look at just a hand or two where we might consider vulnerability. We are north. West opens the bidding, so west starts with 1 heart. This is similar-ish to the hand that was over there a minute ago. So west starts with 1 heart. North bids 1 spade, an overcall, 5 plus spades, 6 plus points. Nothing particularly fancy. East bids 2 hearts, which is I have 4 hearts with you and I don't have many points, 6 to 9, something along that region. And south bids 2 spades. So what are you expecting from south for their 2 spade bid?
3 spades.
3 spades, and that's it. So they promised us some spades, and that's about that. West bids 3 hearts, which to me looks competitive. We are arguing about what should be trumps, us and them. Good for us, we have spades. Spades over hearts is always good, because it means what you tend to find is that you win these part score battles, simply because you can bid at the same level as them. We can bid 2 spades over their 2 hearts, and 3 spades over their 3 hearts. We have an advantage. Now this is where you might be considering, should I bid 3 spades, should I not bid 3 spades? We don't want to defend hearts. 3 hearts look bad from our perspective, doesn't it? We're going to take 2 tricks, maybe 3 if the king-queen happens to materialise as 2 tricks. In themselves. So, defensively speaking, we are quite unlikely to be able to defeat 3 hearts. So we're in a position where really we want spades as trumps, which is what our partner was trying to tell us and what we were trying to tell them. So, we have a decision to make. The level of the fit has been reached, hasn't it? We have reached the level of the fit because our partner has told us they have 3 spades. We have 5 is 8. We should only bid for 8 tricks according to the total trumps principle. However, we really don't want to defend 3 hearts. So there's probably some of you in the room want to bid 3 spades, and probably some of you in the room don't want to bid 3 spades. That depends on if you like your gambling nature or not. However, what you need to consult in these moments is the vulnerability. This is where it comes into play. It's almost always in a competitive scenario. Not always, but almost always a competitive scenario where you're considering that 1 extra trick. Should we push? So if this were the board, you need to look in the middle of the board, basically. I haven't got one here, so I'll have to do that. If that were the board, well, firstly, West was the dealer, so this is not quite true, but you know what I mean. Therefore, north-south are not vulnerable, which means north is more inclined to make the decision to bid 3 spades. If that were the scenario, north-south, well, north, is much less likely to bid 3 spades. I would bid 3 spades not vulnerable, and I would pass vulnerable. It is that fine, but it does sway me one way or another. No, I don't really want to be in 3 spades, I want to be in 2 spades. But the key point is, I don't want to defend 3 hearts. I don't think anyone here with this hand would want to defend 3 hearts, because you're sort of lambs to the slaughter time a little bit, defending 3 hearts. I mean, our partner might have something. So I would bid 3 spades when not vulnerable, because I think that pushing that 1, we have pushed by bidding 3 spades, we have stretched by 1, haven't we? By doing so not vulnerable, you are going to be punished less. Basically, you lose half as many points. Whereas if we push vulnerable, it's not often a good idea unless the level of fit says so. So basically, I would pass not vulnerable and bid 3 spades vulnerable with this particular hand. If you were to change the hand to that, the level of the fit is 3 spades. It is 3 spades. So I wouldn't be concerned about being vulnerable or not. Yes, I would prefer to be not vulnerable, naturally, because I don't want to go off, which I might. But I would bid 3 spades on any vulnerability now, because it's important that the level of the fit is around about the correct number. If we are unlikely to go more than 1 off if we follow the level of the fit. Ignoring the level of the fit is only something you should be doing if you're sensing something else is going on, like you've got a really weird shape, or you're not vulnerable and you're pushing that 1 extra. Going 2 beyond the level of the fit in a competitive scenario is unlikely to be the right thing ever. It could be. You could create a hand where it's the right thing to do, but basically the level of the fit shouldn't really be ignored, if only ever by 1.
If you just take that last spade off again, Dom. So if your partner bids 3 spades, they're not really telling you anything. Presumably, you just have. I mean, what would you think?
Well, firstly, West has got a different decision over 3 spades now,
Yeah.
because it depends on whether they're bidding 4 hearts or not. If they do bid 4 hearts, I would be tempted to bid 4 spades not vulnerable, but I would never bid 4 spades vulnerable. Basically the same thing, but I am a bit more uncomfortable with it because we're a level higher. The thing here is, if they do bid 4 hearts, let's say they are vulnerable, and we are not, so it is that. If they make their 4 hearts, which looks likely to me, if they make their 4 hearts, they're not getting 420, they're getting 620. So when the opponents are vulnerable, you can also consider it from that way around. When the opponents are vulnerable, they stand to gain more when they've bid game. So you are more inclined to try and rob it off them, even though you know you're going to go off.
So you might bid 4 spades then?
Yeah. But I think vulnerable, I don't think I would, because I'm too frightened, basically, which isn't like me.
North and not vulnerable, you would?
I would bid 4 spades, which is a stretch, isn't it? It's one too many, really. But not vulnerable, I think it's worth the push.
Okay.
Tom, would at this stage, when you're worrying about that or thinking about that, would your points ever come into it? So, you know, either you or your partner actually, this is the level of our fit, but I've got a lot of potential winners here.
Yes, my defensive tricks would come into mind. If I thought that 4 hearts was definitely going to go off, I wouldn't bid a contract I thought was going to go off itself. So if I had a lot of defensive tricks, I mean, this is highly unlikely being an overcaller, but if I had something that I knew or I really strongly suspected 4 hearts was going to fail, I wouldn't bid a contract I thought was going to fail myself.
Yeah.
But it's highly, highly unlikely that that can be the case. What actually impacts me more in these decisions is shape. And the reason for that, and something you will realise as you get more and more into the game of bridge, shape heavily impacts your trick-taking potential. If I change this hand to make it more flat, that is far worse. The fact I've moved a diamond to a heart, nothing has really changed about the hand, but it has. What's happened is we are now going to lose 2 hearts, not 1. That's a trick I've just lost. Do you see? So that's as good as an ace, you could argue. The fact I've moved that heart down to a diamond, that's as good as giving me an ace. You could argue that, couldn't you? So what impacts me on these decisions, these fine decisions, is vulnerability and shape of the hand. And defensive tricks. If I think we can actually defeat their contract, I would pass and let's see if we can actually have a go. Which isn't guaranteed, of course. They might have a void in spades or something, but yeah, it's more about shape really rather than points. But if you do have a really powerful defensive hand, I would consider just defending instead. It's unlikely you can bid a contract you can make as the overcallers when you get to these levels. It's not never, but it's not very likely you can make, let's say, 10 tricks when this hand could potentially have 0 points. Potentially, if they've had their Weetabix that morning or something. Okay.
So you bid 4 spades at the top, right? Not particularly because you want to play in 4 spades, but because you don't want to let them win 4 hearts.
Correct. Yeah, correct.
Okay.
I'm much more happy with 4 spades there because now they're more likely to make 4 hearts, and I'm more likely to get nearer 4 spades.
Yeah.
And as you get more and more silly,
Yeah.
it becomes more and more that way. Okay. So, when you are not vulnerable, be willing to push for that one extra trick, especially when you're messing them about, i.e. you're the overcallers. Be willing to push them. As I say, what happens with human psychology more often than not is that they will go, well, I'm not defending spades. And you are now in a win-win situation. If they make 5 hearts, well, that's life, isn't it? If they go off in 5 hearts, you have gained points by pushing them. So it's not only a mathematical advantage, it's also a psychological advantage when you push. However, being vulnerable, going back to, let's say, this hand, I wouldn't bid 4 spades with this hand because I'm too concerned with the opponents electing to defend instead and me going flailing off in 4 spades. It could be disastrous 4 spades if my partner's got 4 small spades and the king of clubs or something. You know, that's they're entitled to bid on that because that's our style. So being vulnerable, you should be slightly more cautious.
Do you only get vulnerable when you're playing duplex bridge? Do you just...
I don't know rubber bridge well enough to know, but I believe you get vulnerable when you've made a game or something, don't you? Yeah. I've played rubber bridge twice in my life, so I don't really know. But essentially, the vulnerability is very different in rubber bridge. I know that, and it changes based on what's happened previously. Whereas the duplicate bridge, when you're playing hand 3, this is the vulnerability, whatever's come before or after. But rubber bridge is entirely different. The scoring I'm referring to is duplicate bridge. Yeah. Okay, which is the bridge I'm teaching because that's what everyone's playing downstairs and the most modern, most widely played version. Okay? Changing up, the north hand's very similar to the one before, but instead now we're the openers rather than the overcallers. I've made my partner, south, open the bidding 1 heart. We responded 1 spade because that's what you're going to do, that's normal. East-west are not getting involved, and south has now bid 3 spades. So what does south have for their bidding? Are they balanced or unbalanced?
5-4.
16.
5-4.
I've got a combination of or what everyone just said. 16 plus points, yeah. And they should have 5 hearts, 4 spades. That's what they're telling us, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
So they've got a good hand, 16, let's say, and 5 hearts, 4 spades. So we have the spade fit, don't we? Should we bid game is the question. Because we have a spade fit, so we're now deciding, should we be in 3 spades or should we be in 4 spades? That's the decision, isn't it? Now, there are some of you who will go, yeah, I'm bidding 4 spades all day. Some of you might think, I'm concerned because we might not have enough for game. That depends on your nature. However, vulnerability also comes into this decision because what you stand to gain is worth noting. If you are not vulnerable, making a game is, I'm going to say only, but it's still a good score. You only get 420 not vulnerable. If you're vulnerable, you stand to gain 620. So, making a bid pushing for game is more attractive when vulnerable as long as you make it. So if you like, you're rolling the dice. You're running the risk of sacrificing your part score in an attempt to gain a big bonus because you are vulnerable. So, I think I've made this hand ever so slightly too good because I think I'd bid 4 spades whatever the weather. But I would be much happier bidding 4 spades vulnerable. Now this is counterintuitive because what I've just said previously was if you're going to go off, that is bad. You do not want to bid aggressively when vulnerable. That's making an assumption that you are bidding a contract you know is likely or incredibly likely to fail. Here we're bidding 4 spades. I think we should have a reasonable chance of 4 spades, even if our partner has the minimum 16 points, or even 15 if they've stretched. We should have a reasonable chance. I'm not saying it's guaranteed, but if we do make game, instead of 170 in 3 spades, we make 620. It is massive. It's almost 4 times as much. It is, 3 and a bit times as much. It is really a big, big score. So, being vulnerable, when you do decide to go for the game, the gamblers out there, you will be rewarded when you are vulnerable, more so than when you are not vulnerable. So if you are on the cusp of going for game or not, it might be worth considering pushing for the game because you are vulnerable. So being vulnerable is sort of enigmatic in itself. I've just told you don't bid aggressively, but now I'm telling you to bid more optimistically. They are 2 opposite things. The reason they're different is because here we have the balance of the points and we actually might make game, whereas this previous situation, the opponents had the balance of the points and we were simply trying to rob the contract off them. Different scenarios. In competitive scenarios, being vulnerable is bad. When you are bidding because you actually can make something, being vulnerable is good as long as you bid game or above. Okay? And that's why it's tricky, really, because it's 2 sides of the coin.
If North had the ace of diamonds instead of the king, you'd definitely go for
I bid game all day, yeah. All day.
Okay.
Not concerned at all, whatever vulnerable. Even if it was hyper vulnerable, I'd bid it. or hyper not vulnerable. Okay? So what I want to stress there is a few important points. Being vulnerable is only bad when you're in a part score. Being vulnerable is bad when you are in a competitive scenario expecting to fail or fail a lot in your contract, i.e. the overcallers. Being vulnerable is a positive when you bid game and above, only game and above. And that's only when you make your contract. Okay? It does not impact your basic bidding. It doesn't change when you should respond, what you should respond, or how you should support your partner. It doesn't change how you really bid as an opener or a responder at all. Only when you get to those fine margin decisions later on in the bidding. It does impact somewhat the way you bid as an overcaller because you're entitled to be more aggressive when not vulnerable, at anticipating a competitive scenario. When you're an overcaller, you anticipate everyone's going to start mucking in. So being an overcaller, being not vulnerable, you're entitled to be more aggressive. Being vulnerable, you should be more sound with your bidding. Okay? Now, what I'm going to introduce us to this evening are these things. These are known as travellers because they travel with the board. So, I assume that's why they're called that anyway. There's a thing underneath the board which has got a little flap like that, you probably can't see it, but basically you can shove a sheet of paper underneath there and it traps it underneath. These are a nightmare, by the way, they're very difficult to get underneath, you'll see in a minute. What I want us to do tonight, for the first time and from here on out, is when you have played a hand, I want you to write the contract that you played in, the score you got, who it was by, north, south, east or west, not your name unless you want to, the tricks you took, and how many points you gained or lost on that particular set of hands. And this is where us playing the same hands becomes really useful because you can compare against everyone else in the room. You made 4 hearts vulnerable, that's 620. They went 4 spades off 2, so they lost 100. So you can see how you bidding 4 hearts was better than defending 4 spades, for example. So what you will be able to see is a direct comparison for those people, other people in the room who have played the same cards. So you can actually look, I did better than you, or I did worse than you. Now I don't want you to start goading, but what it does, it gives you a ballpark of where you were in the hand. Were you miles off? Did you make the correct number of tricks? Did you bid too optimistically? Gives you a marker to compare yourself against. So far you bid 4 hearts and made it, and you don't know if that's good or not, because others might have bid a slam, others might have only bid a part score. Now you will know. Okay? What we use in actual modern day bridge are bridge mates, which are a little computer where you enter your score and the computer works it all out. We don't have to do any of this old-fashioned handwriting stuff. The reason I'm doing this is for 2 reasons. It gets you used to working out the score yourself rather than the computer just doing it for you. And using the bridge mate server means we have to get a second server and they're using it downstairs. So we can't do that anyway. But essentially, by doing this, what you will do, hopefully, is you get into the habit of scoring and learning what the scores are, and then you will see the benefits or not on your bidding, depending on how aggressive or passive you were. Okay?